I'm going to do is I want to welcome up on stage a special guest. As I mentioned, this individual has been consulting to Magellan, to myself and our investment team over the last 18 months, giving us tremendous insight in some of these geopolitical risks we're seeing around the world. The individual's name is Michael Morell. Michael was the former Deputy Director of the CIA in America. He was then the acting director of the CIA. He was a senior daily liaison officer during the Bush administration. He has given us so much valuable insight to a lot of these incredibly complex issues that are occurring. So Michael, would you come and join me? Well, welcome, Michael. Welcome to Sydney.
It's great to be in Sydney. It's better to be in Sydney than Washington, D.C., let me tell you.
I may start with, just to give you a little bit of background, Michael, you've seen so many big events over the last 20 or 30 years. You've been at the coalface in very senior positions in the CIA. Could I just ask you, where were you on September 11?
So from January of 2001 to January of 2002, I was President Bush's daily intelligence briefer. So I was with the president every morning, 6 days a week, no matter where he was in the world, in the Oval Office, at Camp David, at his ranch in Texas, traveling overseas or traveling in the United States. So on September 11th, I was with him all day long.
And what are the sort of memories from that day? What most stands out to you?
Well, you won't be surprised that it's etched in my memory as if it were yesterday. But if I were going to summarize, I'd say that it was a mixture of the intensity of doing my job with the surreal. So an example of the intensity of doing my job was very early in the day on Air Force One. The president asked to see me in his private office on Air Force One. And he looked me in the eye and he said, "Michael, who did this?" It's the kind of direct question you get from a president. And I said, "Mr. President, I haven't seen any intelligence that would take us to a perpetrator. So what you're going to get is my best guess." And he said, "I understand the caveat," now get on with it. I told him that there were two nation states in the world, Iran and Iraq, that had the capability to do this, but neither of them had anything to gain, and both of them had everything to lose. So I didn't think it was one of them. No, I told him that when we got to the end of the trail, I thought we would find Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden. And I told him that I would bet my children's future on that. I haven't told my kids that. He then looked at me and said, "When will we know?" Which is, again, a kind of direct question you get. There is no answer to that, obviously, so I tried to give him some context. I went back in time to previous attacks on the United States and how long it took us to find out who did it. So in the case of the bombing of our embassies in East Africa, it took 2 days, I told him. In the case of the bombing of a U.S. warship in Yemen, it took us several months. And in the case of the military barracks in Saudi Arabia, it took us almost a year to figure out who did it. So I said, "Mr. President, we may know soon, and then again, it may take us some time." So there were several moments like that during that day of the intensity of doing my job. An example of the surreal, and there were many, was on final approach to Andrews Air Force Base back in Washington, D.C. that evening. I saw the president's military aide looking out the window. The president's military aide is the guy who carries the nuclear football with the nuclear codes. He was looking out the window. He saw me looking at him, and he waved me over. So I go to the window, and he said, "Look." And I looked out, and there was a fighter jet on the wingtip of Air Force One. It was close enough that you could see the pilot, you could see his facial features, and you could see him looking at us. The president's military aide told me that there was another fighter jet on the other wingtip. And one of the surreal aspects of it was, if you looked beyond the fighter jet, you could see the still burning Pentagon. Then the military aide told me that, "Do you know what the purpose of those fighters are?" Because by that point in the day, every civilian aircraft in the United States had been grounded. I said, "No. What's the purpose?" He said, "If somebody fires a surface-to-air missile at Air Force One as we are landing. It is the job of those fighter jets to put themselves between that missile and the plane. So it gives you an example of the surreal.
And you were also with the Obama administration, and you were in even a more senior role in the CIA at that point in time. Do you have any memories that stand out during the Obama times?
So I was with President Obama on May 1st when we brought Bin Laden to justice. So I kind of bookended 9/11 and then bringing him to justice. And I think most people think that that's the most memorable moment for me for Obama, but it really wasn't. The most memorable moment was the previous September, so September of 2010, when Leon Panetta, who was then the director of CIA, and I went to tell the president in the Situation Room with only 3 of his aides, to tell the president that we think we found Bin Laden. And we gave him all of the reasons why we suspected that Bin Laden might be hiding in this particular compound in Pakistan. But we told him that we think he's there, but we're not sure. And I remember very, very clearly that at the end of that meeting, the president gave us 2 orders. And they came across as orders, not suggestions. He said, number 1, find out what's going on inside that compound. Those are the exact words he used. And then number 2, don't tell anyone. Don't tell the Secretary of State, don't tell the Secretary of Defense, don't tell the Attorney General, don't tell the Director of the FBI, don't tell anyone. This was the best kept secret in my 33 years in government. But that day stands out to me, actually more than the day we got Bin Laden.
Michael, maybe we could move on. You know, are we being trumped is the theme of today, and a lot of people talk about the unpredictability of Trump and not understanding what he's doing and why he's doing. What do you actually think is going on in the White House, and what do you think is driving the president's agenda?
So I'm not in these meetings in the White House, obviously. So this is me kind of assessing my own country the way I used to assess others. But my best sense, based on what I read and what I see, is that most of what he does every day is playing to his political base. And there are 2 dynamics at play, I think, with his political base that are very important to understand when you think about what he is doing and what he might do going forward. And those 2 dynamics are, number 1, deep economic anxiety on the part of a significant number of Americans. What's deep economic anxiety? It's a sense that your economic life is not going to get any better, and more importantly, a sense that your children's economic life is not going to be any better than yours. So kind of the destruction of the American dream, right? Many of these people used to vote Democratic. Many of these people voted for Barack Obama twice, felt Barack Obama did not deliver, did not make their life any better, and they turned to Trump. And they blame not the thing that is largely driving where they are, automation, but they blame trade and immigration for their economic condition. So not surprising the president has focused on those. The fundamental issue here, I think many of you know, is that it used to be possible to be an unskilled worker in the United States and be in the middle class. That's where my father was as an auto worker. It is no longer possible to be unskilled and be in the middle class, right? The modern economic world has left you behind if you're unskilled. So that's one of the 2 dynamics. It's actually not the most important. If you told pollsters on Election Day in 2016 that you had economic anxiety, you were 2.5 times more likely to vote for Trump than Clinton. The second dynamic is social anxiety. The second dynamic is a belief on the part of white, working class, Christian Americans, which make up 33% of the adult population, a belief on their part, a fear on their part, that the far left, the rise of women, the growing proportion of minorities in our population immigration, foreign countries pose an existential threat to their value and their culture. So these people are anti-abortion, they're anti-gay rights. When you ask them, what decade would you like to live in if you could choose any decade, they say the 1950s. Barack Obama, when he left office, gave a speech in which he said the best time in history, if you could choose to be born at any time in history, you would choose now. You can see the fundamental difference there. If you told a pollster on election day in 2016 that you had social anxiety, you were 4.5 times more likely to vote for Donald Trump. So hence the focus on immigration, hence the playing of the race card, hence the focus on playing to the far right with the choice of Supreme Court justices, right? That's what I think is driving his decision.
So he really has a coalition of the far right in terms of deep conservatives, and that was the Kavanaugh issue, plus the people have been left behind. They're about 33% of the population, are they? Plus that nearly gets him to 50% of the population.
Yeah, so I think,
and the rest, he doesn't care who he offends because they're just not the coalition.
So I think there were 3 pieces to his coalition. One is his base, which I just described to you. Right? That's probably low 30s. Maybe a little bit more, 35%. Then there are the conservative Republicans who really cared most about his economic policies, right? That he was going to have more market-oriented economic policies in terms of tax policy, in terms of deregulation, than Secretary Clinton would have. And so they swallowed hard with his character and with his demagoguery, right? And then the third part were a group of people that simply didn't like Secretary Clinton, quite frankly, most of them women. So that was his coalition. So I think the first 2 pieces hold. In 2020, we'll see about that third piece, depending on who the Democrats choose.
Yeah. I may move to China now, and I spoke a bit about China earlier. In 2014, James Comey, who was then the director of the FBI, he made a very famous quote about China. He said, I mean, there are 2 kinds of big companies in the United States. There are those that have been hacked by the Chinese and those who don't know they've been hacked by the Chinese. From your former role, do you believe that China is posing a major strategic threat to the US and other Western countries? I spoke about the trade issues being different. Do you see it as a major strategic threat, or is this just rhetoric here?
So I do. I mean, I see China as the #1 national security threat challenge facing the United States and our allies, of which Australia is a very important one. If I were to make a list of all the national security threats and challenges we face, there'd probably be 20 or 25 on the list. China would be #1, and there'd be a huge gap between #1 and #2. There are 3 fundamental issues that we have with the Chinese, and all of them are long-term, and all of them are difficult to think about how do you deal with this. The first is the one you talked about, Hamish. 25 years ago, the U.S. was capital-rich, China was labor-rich. Those 2 things fit together like a glove. So the 2 economies were complements to each other. That's exactly what we saw play out over the last 20 years. But now we're competing in the same areas, all the ones you put up on the screen, right? So we're no longer complements, we're competitors in a very deep way with 2 completely different models. One an industrial policy model and the other a market-oriented model. So you have this competition over future high-tech industries. The second is the Chinese military. The second is a military issue. The Chinese military has grown more rapidly and in a more sophisticated way than any other military in human history. I would not want to fight the Chinese in a war today in East Asia. And because the United States and China have large militaries on the same place on the planet, we have to plan for war against each other. We have to equip ourselves for war against each other in terms of the weapon systems we buy. And we have to exercise those plans and those weapon systems. And guess what? Both sides see the other side doing those three things. That creates a natural tension in the relationship, a natural inertia in the relationship in the wrong direction. And then you get to the third big issue, which is the really tough one. Compared to the other two, as hard as they are, is the really tough one. And the really tough one, the third issue, is that the United States is a status quo power. China is a rising power. And because China is a rising power, it wants a greater say in the world around it. And guess who has that say today? The United States and our allies. So how does that fundamental problem of there's only so much power, there's only so much influence to go around, and how are we going to share it, how does that get resolved? Let me just add one more thing that I think drives the point home. Why are we so worried about China playing a significant leadership role in the world? Why does that matter? And it matters for two reasons. First, it matters because is there anybody here who believes that China is going to treat the rest of the world any differently than it treats its own people? And you all know how it treats its own people. And then number two, as China takes a larger leadership role in the world, it becomes more of a role model for other countries in terms of how you organize yourself politically in an authoritarian way versus a democratic way, and how you model yourselves in terms of an economic system, managed capitalism versus free market capitalism. So none of that, I think, in my view, is healthy.
And in my presentation, there was a slide of deal or no deal with the trade dispute, with markets being very complacent around this risk. Two questions. Do you think President Xi is going to effectively back off China's ambitions and give a comprehensive back down to the United States in a deal here? Or do you think Trump's going to back down here and do a USMCA style deal that's cosmetic, or are both sides going to dig in here? You know, where do you sort of sit on this spectrum of a quick deal being done versus a no deal?
It's hard in my mind to see an overlap where a deal would be possible, right? Certainly Xi Jinping would be, as you said, be willing to sign a deal that says we will buy billions of dollars more in American exports. We will work over 5 years to get rid of that deficit. He'd sign that deal in a heartbeat. But he's not going to give up their ambitions for technological leadership, right? And while Trump has an incentive to show that he's a great deal maker, show the electorate that before 2020 that he's a great deal maker, he's constrained by the fact that it is now an accepted view in the United States across the political spectrum, with economic types, with national security types, that China poses a long-term threat. So the president's constrained in that limited deal that he could make. So could there be a deal? Absolutely. I don't think so. I think more importantly, this relationship over the long term is evolving into a Cold War. That's where I think we're heading. Not the kind of Cold War we had with the Soviet Union based on nuclear weapons and proxy wars in Latin America and Africa, but a Cold War based on economics.
A little concerning.
Yes.
So more of a standoff relationship between...
I think so, for a long time.
But not a physical war, an economic war.
So it's a physical war certainly possible over Taiwan, over the South China Sea, over North Korea, but it would take miscalculation on both parts.
I'd like to now move on to something that I don't think is getting a lot of commentary in the markets, and that's really the cyber threats in the world and cyber warfare. Have you read just a fabulous book by David Sanger called The Perfect Weapon?
Yes, I have.
I'm pleased Michael has. He was featured in the book quite a lot. And it outlines a number of the capabilities of nations and how sophisticated they are, countries like the United States and the UK and Israel, but also the adversaries, Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, and it goes through in some detail some recent cyber attacks that have been perpetrated. I think some of them were Russia taking down the critical infrastructure of the Ukraine, Russia hacking the Pentagon's network in 2008, of course the interference in 2016 in the US elections, Chinese hacking Lockheed Martin, hacking a grid software company that held the blueprints for half the oil and gas pipelines in the Western world. They hacked the US Office of Personnel Management and took 22 million records of US citizens. North Korea hacked Sony and then released the WannaCry virus that took down many Western businesses in the world. Iran's been at it. They hacked Saudi Aramco and took down the entire computer infrastructure of the largest oil and gas enterprise in the world. And they actually hacked Bank of America and JP Morgan and took down their banking systems. I didn't think that got a lot of press. You know, as you were looking at from an intelligence and security point of view, and I assume these things are real in this book, are they?
They're all real.
So they're all real. What are the ones, or what stood out for you of something that really gave you concern of what's happening?
So I think there's two things about the list that stand out to me. One is how long it is, how significant all of those were. The truth of the matter is there are millions of cyber attacks every day against governments, against companies, and against individuals. It's a new tool, so we're just learning to defend ourselves against it. There aren't international norms yet. It has a couple of huge advantages as a tool. Offense gets to move before defense, right? So the adversary is always upgrading how they do attacks, and the defense is catching up. Think of a sport where the offense gets to move a half second before the defense. Think about that advantage. It has another advantage. It's tough to attribute. So in each one of those cases, it took some time to figure out who did those attacks. And in some cases, you know with high confidence who did the attacks. In some cases, you don't. So this is a really big deal. This problem is going to get worse before it gets better. It used to be only that big nation states that were willing to invest the resources to develop these tools were a threat. Now you can buy these tools. You can buy tools to get into a network, to steal information from a network, and to do damage to a network on the dark web. The tools are actually pretty cheap. So smaller nation states are getting into this business. Organized crime is into this business in a very significant way. In 2014, something significant happened. Organized crime made more money via cyber extortion than it did in the illicit drug trade. So this is big dollars for organized crime. There's a huge internal rate of return to this for organized crime. If it were a legal business, you would get your clients into it. It's that kind of rate of return. It's big business, so you're going to see more of that. But the other one that stands out to me, Hamish, is the Russia attack on our election. And the reason that stands out to me is because all of the other ones were foreseeable. All of the other ones we actually saw coming. So if you go back and look at the last 10 years of the heads of the U.S. intelligence community testifying in public to Congress every January, there's always a big section on cyber, for the last 10 years. And they warned about all of the attacks we're talking about there. Attacks on critical infrastructure, attacks for extortion purposes, attacks to steal information, intellectual property, national defense information. They warned about all of those. But nobody imagined that Russia would use social media, would weaponize social media. Nobody saw that coming. So that worries me because it says to me, what else is possible in the cyber world that we're not yet imagining, that somebody's going to think about?
And if you were thinking from an investment point of view, are there certain industries, nothing's immune here, anything can be attacked, anyone can have ransomware put on it, anyone with data can have their data stolen and credit card information and customer lists stolen. At the end of the day, it's a war that's going on in terms of cyber defences here. But are there industries that if this really got hot, there are industries you'd be more concerned about that would be very vulnerable for major attack?
So critical infrastructure, right, is the area. What's critical infrastructure? We define it as finance, telecommunications, and energy. And if you read the paper, you know that the Russians and the Chinese are aggressively putting tools in place to be able to attack that critical infrastructure. But I believe, and most analysts, national security analysts, believe that the Chinese and the Russians would only actually conduct those attacks if we were in a hot war with them. So you're not going to wake up tomorrow and the Russians take down the eastern power grid in the United States. That would only happen if we were actually fighting each other. So I don't think there's
But do you think there's a risk that they do a demonstration of something relatively small in critical infrastructure just to wake up the capabilities there?
Because they know they're just as vulnerable, right?
So the US isn't innocent in this, in terms of their capability.
I mean, we behave a little bit differently, but look, we're prepared to fight a cyber war too, right? And they know that.
Yeah. I may wrap up with one final question. We've got the midterm elections coming up in 2 weeks. If you believe the opinion polls, and we've all been wrong on this before, it looks like the Democrats are in a pretty strong position in the House. They have to take 23 seats to take the House. I think a lot depends on the women vote and the turnout of what actually happens. It doesn't look like they take the Senate because that's a much harder pathway. But if they were to lose, the Republicans lose the House, is this good news for markets, or could Trump be even more erratic if the Democrats take the House?
So I think there's a conventional wisdom that I see in Washington and in the American media that somehow the Democrats taking the House is going to make things better because it will constrain the president. And it will certainly constrain him on some legislation that he would like to get done. But I think in general, it's going to make the politics of Washington worse because the Democrats aren't going to sit by idly. There's going to be two things that's going to happen if they take the House. The first is they will investigate pretty much everything the Trump administration has done for the last 2 years that has any sort of question mark above it. So they will subpoena witnesses from the executive branch, they will subpoena documents, they will go to town on investigations. And secondly, although it's not set in stone, I think it's highly likely if the Democrats take the House that they will move to impeach the president. And it only takes 50 votes in the House to impeach the president, so I think if they go down that road, they will impeach him just the way Bill Clinton was impeached. And it really doesn't matter what Bob Mueller finds or doesn't find. I think they will head in this direction because there's such animosity between the Democrats and the president. He won't be convicted by the Senate, so he won't be removed from office, but he will probably be impeached. And you put both of those things together, the investigations about pretty much everything and an impeachment process, and it makes the politics of Washington even uglier. And I think it drives the president, it makes the president even more erratic, and I think it drives the president even more to his base. So even more on anti-immigration, anti-trade, for example.
So not exactly a stable environment to be heading into.
It's intelligence analysts are known as glass half empty people, so that's pretty much what I just gave you.
Well, I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Michael. For us at Magellan, Michael has just been a tremendous resource. We speak to him at least once a month, our investment team and myself. You read a lot of things in the newspaper. There's nothing like getting views for somebody who's been at the coalface and someone who is still so deeply connected to many regions around the world. Michael and I have spent much time in the last week. We haven't even touched on Russia or North Korea or what's just going on with Saudi Arabia at the moment, or Iran. There are so many other issues in the world. We could have spent all afternoon talking about it, but these are the other issues we talk about. So Michael, thank you for all the time you spend with us and all the insight you give us. And I may hand to Frank just to quickly wrap it up.
Sure. So incredibly insightful and a little bit thought-provoking, I would have thought. So let me close by thanking everyone for your attendance, and more importantly, thank you for your ongoing support. Without you, Magellan kind of doesn't exist. So very heartfelt thank you. You will be getting an email from us giving you or offering you a 1.5 point CPD for your attendance here today. And also the opportunity to give us, to send us any questions that you may want covered, given that we didn't get the opportunity to do the Q&A as we normally do. A couple of very quick mentions. Magellan also manages the High Conviction Fund. You heard a little bit about the Global Fund. High Conviction's now got a 5-year track record of over 17% per annum. And it's co-managed by Hamish and one of our other portfolio managers in Chris Weldon, who's in the room here today. We've also recently launched some B-class units in that fund, which basically has a lower base fee and a higher performance fee. And again, I'd commend you to have a look at that. Probably the best kept secret at Magellan is the capabilities of our amazing infrastructure team. Again, Gerald and the team are here in the room today. That's delivered over 8% per annum since inception, over 11% per annum over the last decade, and that is after fees as well. Yes, Magellan is also in the Aussie equity space with the recent acquisition of the Airlie business. Again, both Emma Goodsell and Matt Williams are in the room. We've got some early ratings. We're on a lot of platforms, and next month we will be launching the ability to trade in those units via the ASX. So watch this space, so to speak. The last point I just wanted to mention quickly was Magellan's very proud to be involved in an initiative called Hearts and Minds, and one of the brains of the outfit there is Matt Grounds from UBS. It's basically an IPO for an LIC where the capital is allocated to managers' best ideas, and you can see some of those managers mentioned there. Importantly, the proceeds from the fees generated from the LIC are donated to medical research in this country, and again you can see some of the potential beneficiaries mentioned there. We're incredibly proud to be a part of that. We were part of Social Ventures Australia through Third Link, and Chris Cuff's in the room here today, and also part of FGG, Future Generations, which for declaration purposes I'm a director of, but we've also got Jeff Wilson, Louise Walsh and others from FGG. So we're very proud to be associated with. The good news that sometimes the financial services industry doesn't necessarily quite get. To our marketing team, thank you very much. To Mark Jordan, Mark Burgess, Emma and all the New South Wales team, Dan, and Jack, thank you for looking after our most important relationships here in New South Wales. We have the executive team, we have Brett, our new CEO, still getting used to that, Brett, but we have Brett, our new CEO, here in the room as well. To everyone, have a great rest of 2018 and safe travels back to your office. Thank you.